Private care homes, GPs and hospices have voiced concerns they'll have to pay the higher employer national insurance contributions announced in the budget. They're not covered by the exemption for the public sector, despite providing NHS services.
Anyway, Dan, what would you like to say this morning? Good morning.
Nicky, good morning. Thank you for having me on. So I run a national home care business. We have 71 offices across the UK. Our business, Visiting Angels, employs care workers who go into people's homes. We currently employ in the region of 1,400 people across the country. I guess what I would say is that tax rises were inevitable in this budget. I think, quite apart from the nonsense and the noise there was with regard to black holes, our sector is woefully underfunded. And so, as a owner of a home care business, I was expecting the budget to mean tax increases to generate more revenue, and I was then expecting some of that revenue to come towards home care providers. I think important distinction, I don't do local authority commissioned contract work, so I'm not looking for money to go to councils for that money to come to me. I'm a student of the sector as a whole when I talk about it. But the government announced a £600 million increase in funding for social care. There are 1.6 million people in the social care workforce. That funding announcement is an extra £1 per day. That clearly is not going to cover the cost of additional wage costs in terms of the increases in minimum wage. And I think the reality is that our sector at the moment, the home care sector specifically, is being propped up by home care workers who in many instances are being paid below the legal minimum wage. So the government may talk about this being a budget for workers and for people, but while ever we're in a situation where home care workers are being paid below the minimum wage in order for council budgets to balance, it's absolutely not that.
How did they get away with it?
Well, we're a very disparate industry. There are somewhere in the region of 12,000 employers across the home care sector. There are about 600,000 workers working within those organisations. And in my experience, the reason that it happens is because care workers don't understand that they're entitled to be paid for this. There was a report by Unison in June 2023, and in that report it said that 75% of carers are not paid for travel time. In essence, carers are paid for their time when they are sat with a client, but they're not paid for their time when they're transitioning between clients. And the inevitable consequence of local authorities commissioning short visits, if those visits are 15 minutes, 20 minutes or half an hour long, in order to do a day's work, the carer has to do quite a lot of driving between those visits. Maybe 20% of their working day is spent driving between visits. And they're not paid for that, which means if their start pay rate is minimum wage or a little bit over, by the time you take out the unpaid driving, their real-time pay rate drops below minimum wage. Now,
it's outrageous.
When I started, it is, and it's, we're talking, if it is, I've got some figures which suggest it's closer to 60%. Whether it's 60% or 75%, even if it's only 10% of a workforce of 600,000 people, that's 60,000 of the lowest paid workers in society doing one of the hardest jobs in the country who are being paid below minimum wage. Now, I started my business to operate differently. We don't do that. We pay well above minimum wage. We do pay for travel time. We do have proper contracts, not zero-hour contracts. But we are absolutely outliers in our sector because of that. And the biggest problem is that maybe 70% of the work that's delivered in social care is commissioned by councils. And for the providers that are working on those commissioned council contracts, exactly as the text you read out earlier on said, they are not able to put their prices up, but their costs have been forced to be increased. So they're in a position where, unfortunately, the inevitable consequence is that the care workers struggle to be paid correctly.
So what about the national insurance rise? Because that's what we're talking about in this hour. National insurance rises and the NHS. There are various anomalies at the moment. What are your thoughts about this issue?
Well, I made a note with regard specifically to the anomalies because within my business in Sheffield, I do work for the NHS. And when I do work for the NHS, it costs me more given what was announced. The debate about whether a GP practice is a public entity or a private entity is irrelevant when it comes to my business, which is very clearly a private entity, but it is completing work under NHS contracts And unless the pay rate on those NHS contracts goes up, I am being forced to bear additional costs for the care that we're providing for the NHS.
You get the contract. That's how it works, yeah.
Yeah, so we have a gentleman we support in Sheffield who he had a massive stroke in his 50s. He has a tracheostomy, he has a tube feed, tube medication, he has a cough assist machine to stop him choking to death. A member of my team is with that gentleman 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, we picked that contract up because prior to our involvement, he was in a nursing facility costing the NHS about £5,900 a week, and we are about £1,000 a week cheaper than that facility. So we're saving the NHS some money when we do that. But the reality is that the NI increases don't apply to the NHS, but they do apply to me, which means that I'm going to have to put my prices up to the NHS in order to be able to afford to carry on that contract. You know, the cost to my office in Sheffield of the announcement yesterday, and by the way, the increase in national insurance is not actually the biggest issue for me. The biggest issue for me is the lowered threshold, because most of my workers were part-time, and many of them, as a result of that, were falling either just over or just below the threshold as it was.
Down to 5,000, yeah.
Yeah, correct. By halving the threshold and taking it down to 5,000, the cost to my office in Sheffield annually is £38,169. That's what that budget means to my business in Sheffield. Now, yeah, I'm absolutely prepared that some of that will be taken from profits. We're not a massively profitable organisation. We choose to be less profitable in order to pay our carers better. But inevitably what's going to happen is I'm going to have to put some costs up a little bit. I'm going to have to put the prices up a little bit. And I think many businesses across the country will be in the same position, which again sort of makes a bit of a mockery of the suggestion this is not a tax on workers. Because if your coffee shop put the coffee prices up, and your supermarket put the retail prices up, and your taxi firm put the taxi prices up, inevitably it ends up being a tax on workers. And listen, I'm genuinely not disputing the fact that more revenue is needed. Our sector needs it. I do think that a £600 million payment in social care compared to a £22 billion payment for the NHS manifestly underestimates the impact that social care has on the NHS. You know, my teams are supporting NHS trusts across the country to discharge people from hospital quickly, because that's what families want. They want mum or dad to get home as quickly as they possibly can do. We are doing work which is increasingly complex in nature due to the ageing population that we have. The work that used to be done by community nursing teams in some instances, many social care providers are now getting involved in things like CPAP machines and BiPAP machines and stoma bags. There's a lot more complexity in social care. So £600 million plays against £22 billion does feel a little bit like a slap in the face.
It's been really interesting. What really struck me about that text you referred to, which I read earlier on, and this will just resonate with lots of different people in lots of different sectors. If you're working for the local authority, you can't raise your prices because it's a fixed contract. It's fixed contract, and rates are dictated to you. So that's the thing, isn't it?
Well, and I have to say, Nicky, in many instances, the rates that are paid by local authorities are significantly below the market rate. And that is just plain wrong. There are lots of providers across the country that will do a proportion of their work for the council, maybe 70% of their work for the council on a commission basis, okay? And then they do 30% of their work for a private client. Now, the private client is usually in that situation paying a premium for exactly the same service that's being commissioned by the local authority. So whenever I talk about social care, everybody said to me, oh, it's all right, but where's the money going to come from? At the minute, the money's coming from two places. It's coming from care workers being paid illegally because they're not being paid minimum wage, which is a national disgrace. And it's coming from the pockets of private individuals who are paying a premium on the cost of their own care to prop up a council contract which is being bought at an uneconomic rate. That is absolutely disgraceful to think that a private individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, the issues in social care are not issues of demand. I mean, there's an awful lot of demand for the need that the society has. Yeah, the challenges in social care are to do with finding the workforce to be able to deliver that service. You know, we have a vacancy rate in adult social care of 132,000 jobs according to Skills for Care. And I think the lady whose text you read out earlier on, she's clearly not got the profit to be able to absorb these costs, so she's forced to close her business. I can't speak for other people's profits, and we are deliberately less profitable to ensure that we are able to pay our staff better and to also pay travel time and and ensure they're on proper contracts. But that's a decision that we've taken as an organisation. But the reality is, even still, I'm not able to work on a council contract at £20 an hour because there is just no money in that work. The reality is that local authorities are not paying enough to be able to allow providers that do that work to be able to absorb the sort of increasing costs that have been talked about.
Thank you very much indeed. 08085 909 693.